Hi, this video is for higher pupils doing urban geography, and I'm going to focus on our second case study. That's Rio de Janeiro, looking at the challenges they face with their housing. You should have watched already my lesson on the challenges we face in developed countries with our housing, and our case study was Edinburgh. And we would also have looked at transport in Edinburgh. We're now going to follow exactly the same pattern with housing in Rio de Janeiro and transport in Rio de Janeiro. The structure of your revision remains the same. You need to look at the need for change, the solutions to the problems, and the effectiveness of those solutions. So, what are the causes? What are the priorities? What things need to change in Rio de Janeiro's housing? There are lots and lots of things that need to change. What things can we do? What solutions can we put in place to make those changes effective ones? And what are the effectiveness of those solutions when we make them? Okay, so as you can see on the screen, we're going to Rio. Starting off with the need for change. I've broken this down into separate sections which you should take notes on. So pause the video, copy the notes, or take some of the key notes. Rio de Janeiro is one of Brazil's largest settlements. It's growing very, very rapidly due to rural to urban migration, people moving from the countryside. This causes the key point that there is continuous growth of unplanned squatter camps. These squatter camps build up around the edge of the city, and over time they become more established into what we know of as a favela. The rapid growth of the population has led to overcrowding and a shortage of housing. This is your mark winning point. It's simply about demographics. It's about the number of people who are moving to the cities. By pointing out the rate at which the cities are growing, by pointing out the fact that this is causing unplanned squatter camps, and by pointing out that this is causing overcrowding and a housing shortage, you are answering the question, what is the need for Rio de Janeiro to change? The next topic that I would do a paragraph on would be the physical geography of Rio de Janeiro. Rio de Janeiro faces various challenges in its physical geography. One is that it's surrounded, or it's contained, maybe is a better word, by very steep mountains to the north and west, and the sea to the south and east. This means there's no room for the city to grow, and so the density of people is very, very high. The favelas are often built on the less desirable land, that being steeper land, and this can lead to problems like landslides, which I'll talk more about later, which can destroy whole neighbourhoods. There's the problem of the housing itself. Housing areas in Rio are famously segregated. That means separated into rich and poor. Many people who have money kind of shut themselves off within gated communities. So afraid are they of social pressures, theft, violence, crime, etc. Similarly, however, the favelas are often walled off from the richer areas by the richer people, as a means to control the favela's growth. People in favelas often see this as being ghettoized. That means that someone walls you up inside your part of the city and kind of throws away the key to forget about the problem. So the housing itself, one of the problems, one of the needs for change is that Rio faces a massive class division. There are rich and there are poor, but there is no kind of middle ground of affordable housing available for the poor people to bridge that gap. Also underneath the heading of housing is the planning process. There's no formal planning process for a favela. Remember, they start off as squatter camps. Literally people living underneath cloth and tarpaulin. And those over time very slowly get built up and more robust and strengthened into a favela. But there's no planning process, so there's no formal system of addresses. This means if there's no address, if you've not got a postcode, your local government cannot effectively tax you. That may sound like a boring point because I'm talking about taxation and local government, but it's really, really fundamentally important. Just think how important your postcode is to you. You've maybe never thought of it before, but it allows the government to know where you are, to know how many people are in your house. They now know where to send a census to, for example. They know how many services they need to provide, such as schools, doctors, street cleaners, etc. Having a postcode system, a system of addresses, is crucial for the smooth running of any urban environment. And Rio doesn't have that. Squatter camps are also a problem in themselves. Favelas, contrary to common belief, they do actually have quite a lot of electricity provision, although it may be patchy and not very safe. They do have some sanitation, though not 100% of the time, and there may be problems with it. The squatter camps that grow up on the real extreme edge of Rio de Janeiro, they really do have no sanitation at all, no electricity. They're often built on rubbish dumps, as of course that's the area where nobody wants to live. And so they're key for outbreaks of serious diseases like tuberculosis, diphtheria, cholera, and dysentery. They're worth knowing about just on their own because they allow you to make these very bold statements like they have no sanitation, no electric supply, no rule of law, no police patrol. The favelas, it would be incorrect to say these things of a favela, so you need to take care when expressing criticisms of the favela, but the squatter camps, you can be pretty harsh in your criticism. Things are much more black and white. So it's clear that Rio de Janeiro has big need for change in how it's planning its housing. Just to back up a second, you're dividing your revision between the number of people, the sheer size and speed of growth of the cities, the physical geography of the cities, and the housing itself. The fact that they've got a big problem with no affordable housing, the fact that there's no formal planning system, and the squatter camps with their very poor health record. It's nice to look at some pictures too. Now, I'm going to raise some points in these pictures which I've not covered in the text that I've just gone through with you. Some of the favelas often have very narrow streets. Because they've not been planned, because people live cheek by jowl, the streets become very narrow and crammed. This is a consequence of people trying to maximise the space that they have, and as a result, fire can spread very quickly and very easily. And as you can see in this picture, this is taken from a Brazilian news website. The fire services do try to put out the fires, but as you can see here, these firemen are only able to access the fire from a concrete overpass. If this fire was another 50 metres further north, as the picture is orientated, you can see that their water jets simply wouldn't reach that fire, and it means that fires can often just be left to burn as a means of controlling them. Mudslides, huge problem. You can see here the favela is built up on the hillsides, it's the steep land which nobody else wants to live on, and there's good reason why you wouldn't want to live on it. It's really unstable, it's unsafe, and these mudslides happen after heavy rainstorms. This picture needs no further annotation. Anybody caught in these mudslides is very likely to die, and you can see the density of the housing on this hill slope to know that these areas, they had houses on them. Look down here, this area has been completely wiped out. There's a general lack of street lighting, CCTV and regulation in the favelas, and this does lead to a high rate of crime. Take care when you're talking about this in your answers. It's very easy to get off the point and to start to write what, to be frank, would start to sound like a modern studies answer. Keep it with the geography of the urban space. Make sure you're tying your answer to that. It's the lack of street lighting, the lack of CCTV, the lack of addresses, meaning that it's difficult for the police to locate people, that makes crime high within the favelas. Crime and drugs are a valid mark-winning point though, and they cause long-term social problems. Youth employment, life expectancy are both low. As you can see here in this picture, I think this picture summarises a huge amount. There's open trade of drugs in the favelas, and also people openly carry arms as a means to defend themselves and what they see as their property. Here's what I'm talking about with the social divide. There's a few things to pick up on in this picture. First of all, these people living in these apartments here are not the mega rich. That's a mistake to think that. They're actually quite kind of just normal middle class Brazilian people. The problem is that the gap between what we would think of as middle class and then your very, very poor lower class families down here, if I can use such terms, I know that some people don't like to use those terms, but it simplifies things, is absolutely massive in Brazil. The distance between the poorest and then the kind of middle wealth bracket of society is astonishingly huge. There is a similar gap, I should point out, between this middle wealth bracket who would live in these apartments and the super rich. So Brazil has got very big problems with the distribution of wealth in its society. Have a look closely at the picture. You'll see that there's a containment wall. That's a concrete wall that's been built along here, and that has been built by the people on this side of the wall, and that is to stop the spread of the favela. The people on this side of the wall, however, often feel that it is to contain them and to keep the problem contained. And of course, nobody wants to feel like that. And that leads to a very dangerous thing, which is called ghettoization, which is when you start to ghettoize people. That means shutting people up in an area of a city and kind of hoping that you can contain whatever problems you perceive them to have there. That's historically been shown never to successfully work. This is a squatter camp. It's not a formal favela. As you can see, it's still open country and bushes and grass in between the huts. It is a little bit better condition than some squatter camps, which are literally just like a campsite with tents on them. But there's no suggestion here of any electricity. There's no sanitation. You would just use the squat behind a bush to go to the toilet. You can imagine how easily disease will spread here. How do you, for example, dispose of your dead in a scenario like this? Is a simple way for you to understand the challenges faced with living in a scenario like this. There is also absolutely no law and order here. There is no police. There are no services to whom you could appeal should somebody do something that you don't like. It would be essentially lawless, and that would be a terrifying thing. So squatter camps are something to bear in mind, but remember they are different to the favelas. Squatter camps are actually a different category of housing and something that you can score marks from on their own. Getting back into the favelas here, generally a lack of rubbish collection means that the streets become very clogged, very dangerous. You get infestations of rats. Rats carry disease, and of course that's an obvious problem. Sanitation. The favelas do have, let me be clear, problems with sanitation. Not as severe as the squatter camps, but they definitely have them. This is Rocinha, which is one of the most famous favelas in Rio de Janeiro, and you can see here there's the pipe at the top there. Someone's obviously using the shower or water or a toilet or a sink, and the water is just cascading down into this what can only be described as a kind of sump of wastewater. You can see all the pipes coming from the backs of the favelas, and there'll be human waste, food waste, animal waste, all collecting in here, and a really horrible collection of potential pathogens and disease will also then grow there, and that's the danger. All you'd have to do would be to get a tiny spot of that water in your food, and that would be easy to do, and you could become very, very seriously ill indeed. So here's the kind of question that you'd be asked. For a developing city you studied, that's Rio de Janeiro, explain the need for change to its housing provision. Now, in explaining the need for change, you need to be summarising the things that I've just gone through. The problems they've got with urban growth, the population growth. The problems they've got with the housing itself, the problems they've got with the physical geography of the city. Um, be warned, as with elsewhere in this unit, it's very easy to be superficial. That means lacking in detail with your answers. You are going to be expected to give a detailed response, full of case study information. So go back through this video, write down those notes, copy down the writing that you see on the screen in front of you, but really pay attention to picking out the case study details. Try to become familiar with the story of the favelas in Rio, and that's the route to unlocking the marks. Okay, so on to number 2, the section 2 if you like, would be what strategies can we put in place to fix these problems? Before we get started here, I think it's really important that we talk about just a little kind of background. Brazil's authorities have struggled with informal settlements and favela housing for a long time. To properly understand the approaches taken to solving these problems, we need to look at each strategy in turn as a timeline. Now, it's rare for me to just read off the screen like that, but it is really important that you look at it in this way. I'll give you a little warning here. Do not be tempted, I should probably have pointed this out earlier, but do not be tempted to rely upon the level of information that you were required to give at National 5. If you do that, you will simply fail. There's the level of information you gave at National 5 is just not going to cut it. You need to have a greater level of detail. So, giving these strategies and these solutions, I'm giving them in the detail, but also as a timeline so you understand how they came about. First, for a long time, since 1900, since 1890 in fact, the Brazilian government has struggled with migration from the countryside. Squatter camps and favela settlements have existed for a very long time, and indeed it's actually kind of to do with the way the constitution, that's the set of laws, is set up within the Brazilian legal framework, where it isn't very clear when someone is squatting and when someone has just claimed a piece of land as their own. That simple confusion is at the root of the problems they face, where people in the past, we're talking 100 years ago here, turned up migrants out of the countryside turned up, they claimed a little area of land for themselves, and then over the years that snowballed until we're in the situation we're in today. The failure to recognise these people has led to the separation between the favela and the developed city, and that's at the root of the whole problem. The fact that at no stage have they figured out the solution to recognising that the favelas are a formal, real, regulated settlement that we can apply rules to and we can treat like anywhere else. So, over the years they've tried various solutions to unpicking this tangled knot. The first is eradication and forced removal. This has been the kind of fallback position for the Brazilian government for the majority of the time that the favelas have been around. Eradication basically means, as it sounds, bulldozing the settlements flat. Sometimes this would include relocation. It really depends what period of time you're talking about and how much international press attention there is on it. But basically what happens is they destroy the settlement, and in some cases they would relocate the people who did live there to another area. You can criticise this solution. It basically moves the problem somewhere else, and it also causes, and this is the real reason it's not a successful solution, social unrest. Believe it or not, the Brazilian government does still attempt eradication and forced removal today, though it dates back into the 1940s. And in today's culture, the social unrest element is the real problem that makes this a policy which just doesn't work. Okay, next case study. the Plano Diretor. Now, I don't speak Portuguese, so you'll have to forgive my, bad pronunciation. But in 1992, the Plano Diretor took a massive step. They recognised, the Brazilian government, or the Rio de Janeiro, I should say, government, recognised some favelas, not all of them, as legitimate neighbourhoods. This was a huge step. This meant that the locals in those neighbourhoods could be taxed, and therefore social services, like a litter collection, could be provided. That's the Plano Diretor. After that, there was the Favela Bairro. Again, my pronunciation is probably shocking. It was a plan that was put in place, that's the name of the plan. It was put in place between about 1995 and 2010. It's been put in place in stages. If you read about it online, you'll see that it's got arms and legs. It's a huge document. It has all sorts of different aspects to it, so I've tried to simplify this. The local government have tried to, first of all, integrate the favelas into the city, closing the gap between formal and informal neighbourhoods. They did this by recognising some favela neighbourhoods, strengthening their sense of community. Now, that was already underway in 1992 with the Plano Diretor. So that's where we're coming from here. The next thing they decided to do was to upgrade basic infrastructure. This ranged from providing clean water, toilets, street lighting, roads that cars could go on, and pavements for people to walk on, simple things like that. This also included social things such as job training, community programs. These were often quite small scale and had little lasting impact, however. What most of you will talk about, because most of Scotland focuses on this in their exam answers, are two methods. One is called a self-help scheme, one is called a site and service scheme. What you need to be able to do is to talk about them in the appropriate level of detail, and that is where most people fall way wide of the mark. The Rio government had up until this point you see on the screen in front of you, they had taken the steps of the Plano Diretor, and that was recognising that the favelas were neighbourhoods, meaning that the people could be taxed. Second, they did the Favela Bairro plan, where they tried to, as you see on the screen in front of you, they tried to close the gap between formal and informal. This created an informal property market because people actually started to market and sell their houses within the favela. Some favela houses now are actually worth quite a lot of money. This created a sense of community identity. These can be seen as real successes. They tried to upgrade the basic infrastructure. However, some parts of this had little impact because they were too small in scale. They then turned to the Inter-American Development Bank, the IDB. And this was because everything that I've described so far, really, at the bottom of it all, costs money. And Rio de Janeiro doesn't have the money. And the people of Rio de Janeiro don't have the money, largely because it's very difficult to tax them because they don't have addresses because they live in favelas. So they went to a bank and they got a series of development loans. One part of the loan was to do site and service programs. Site and service is when the government steps in and they provide a concrete pad with, that means a platform made out of concrete which has sanitation, drains, electricity all provided, but the actual structure that is your house on top is left up to you. This scheme is really good because residents' legal rights were recognised through the scheme. So if you were building on one of these pre-made concrete pads, you actually were recognised as the owner of that building, not just a squatter or someone who hasn't got real legal licence to the land. Self-help schemes were also started. This is where resources were provided to locals to improve their own homes. This is something called sweat economics. And the idea, basically, is that the government provided bricks, concrete, that's what mortar is, by the way, concrete, and the basic construction materials, but the local people made it affordable because they provided the labour. Um, this sounds great, and it has been largely successful, but when you talk about how effective it is, you want to mention that this does actually rely upon the local people engaging with the training courses offered. I don't know how to lay bricks in a wall. I'm not sure if you do. I think I would need a training course on how to do that. And the people living in the favelas are no different. So the self-help scheme is good because it's affordable, it uses sweat economics, it uses the free labour of people doing the work. However, people need training and they didn't always go to the training courses. Site and service programs are more costly. They're really good because they give the resident legal rights to the building that they're constructing. However, lack of access to finance for construction has been the main holdback to this policy. Okay, last one. The Morar Carioca. Now this is very similar to the Favela Bairro, so there's not much that's new here. But this particular solution focused on the neighbourhoods near the Olympic Village. In 2010, all of Rio's favelas received an upgrade as part of the 2016 Olympic Social Legacy. This had a budget of 8 billion reals. That's what the currency is. And it had massively ambitious plans to address water, sewerage, public health and safety, road surfaces were to be improved, CCTV was going to be put in place. It was going to reach 815 favelas, providing a global model to the world of how to handle informal settlements. However, by 2013, no upgrades had been made, and much of the 8 billion reals had kind of, sort of disappeared, as the Brazilian government is known for having problems with internal corruption. So, when you talk about the Morar Carioca, it's a perfect opportunity to talk about massive funding available, but unfortunately corruption meant that nothing happened. The next thing is the pacification squads. You'll have heard of these in National 5. These are part of the Morar Carioca programme, and it's appropriate that you learn that they are part of this programme. You need to know which solution applies to which. The pacification squads basically are heavily armed, specially trained police units. They deal with drugs crime, pretty much exclusively, although they also deal a lot with human trafficking. Favelas offer perfect hideouts for drug traffickers and human traffickers because, of course, there's no address system, so it's very difficult to establish where anybody is, and it's very difficult to disappear and relocate. Pacification squads are not as friendly as they sound. They're pretty aggressive. They cleared the favelas of crime and gangs. However, they attracted loads of negative press attention, largely because there were human rights violations. Innocent people got in the way. An appalling number of people who were arrested simply didn't reappear. They just disappeared. And obviously there's systemic problems in that. So when you talk about pacification squads, you want to say they were successful insofar as they got rid of crime and gangs. However, also they did it through being overly violent, and we don't want to support that. Also, if you find that a difficult point to express, that last one I'm making, you can make a clearer point, which is that once the crime and gangs had been cleared from the area, many of the remaining residents could no longer afford to live in the favela because now that it was safe, the rent went up by as much as 300%. So that's a really good example of how a pacification squad actually isn't all that good. Because what the Brazilian government failed to do was think to themselves, well, what's going to happen once we get rid of all the crime and the gangs? The rents are going to go up, and there was no facility to put in place these 400 families were basically evicted because they couldn't afford to pay their rent. So, strategies for change. I've just been through a huge amount with you, and you really need to pause this video, rewind it, copy the notes out, read the notes, copy and then copy them, listen to me talk it through, put me on mute and just read and copy. But you need to spend time with these notes. They're complex and they're in detail. You can see there's a lot to get to grips with there. So be selective. Don't try and learn everything, but try and learn two or 3 points from each section. It does help to have images though. In this screen, this shot here, you can see that what many people I think fail to really think about when they learn about the favelas is actually they're much more developed than you think. The squatter settlements are nothing like this, but a favela at night, some of the favelas anyway, this is Rocinha you're looking at, this is one of the most oldest favelas in Rio de Janeiro. They do have electric light. Electricity has been installed by the local government. That was done as part of the Favela Bairro program, and that was done from 1995 to 2010. Now, for writing down this bit that you see on the picture, I'm afraid I would only give you marks at National 5 for that. I need you to develop your answers beyond that point, and that's where you need to be able to say, as part of the Favela Bairro program, 1995 to 2010, electric light has been put in place to reduce crime and to improve the quality of life. So take care with these pictures, guys. You can't just copy the bit on the orange down and expect to get easy marks, but you need to really refer to the written notes just that I've been through in this video. Here's a picture of a site and service scheme. You can see these local guys here are actually building their houses. Now you need to go on a training course to learn how to do this, and they'll have done that. And these concrete pads you see, the floor basically is what I'm talking about, that's been done by the government. Look in the background and you can see existing favela that's not site and service. It's just built on the muddy ground, and you can see that those buildings are nowhere near as robust. Site and service buildings, though they're basic, I mean, what you see here, these 1, 2, 3, 4 guys, they're basically living in the footprint of one house, not a room within a house, but within the footprint of an entire house. But what they have got is a concrete pad to build on. That means their building's not going to fall down if there was a small earthquake. It means it's not going to fall down if there's an earth movement like a landslide or a flood. It means that they've got drainage in this concrete pad. There'll be drains built in, and therefore they can build themselves a basic, clean toilet. So site and service schemes provide basic foundations and sanitations, but the locals have to provide the skill. Community-led projects such as painting streets are a tourist attraction. This was part of the Olympic kind of build-up from 2013 onwards, and it's proved really successful with tourism. People love to go and see these parts of the favelas. I can assure you all of the favela does not look like this, and it's only very specific areas, but with that said, it obviously increases a sense of community cohesion, it improves the look of the area, and really primarily it's a way of getting tourists and tourist money into the favelas. Improvements to roads. Now, we need to take care here because we're not talking about improvements to transportation yet. Just improvements to roads, though, in the favelas. The laying of tarmac and the provision of pavements is a double-edged sword. On one side of it, it has encouraged people to purchase cars. That's not a good thing in the very, very densely packed favelas. That said, though, it is also an opportunity for services to access the favelas, such as rubbish collection. I quite like these wee rubbish dump trucks. Look at this. This is the size of a regular car. They're like mini dump trucks, little off-road mini dump trucks for going up the very steep side streets of the favela. So that's a great thing. Building roads mean that they can actually improve street sanitation. Okay, I talked about slum clearance. Here's an image of slum clearance. Obviously, you've got the big digger here tearing down slum housing. Um, but the bit to focus on are these guys, these security forces. These are the pacification squads, and you can see that they look, they're kind of pretty serious guys, and they're there because there's a lot of social unrest at the government just stepping in and smashing down huge areas of favela. And I think what's important about this picture is you can see what's in the background. If you were living in the favela, you each year would be seeing these glass skyscrapers getting built nearer and nearer and nearer your house, and then one day the government turns up and says, well, you have no formal documentation proving this house is your home, even though you've lived in it for 20 years, so we're going to demolish it. And that's why it's so important that the policies I mentioned earlier, the Plano Diretor and the Favela Bairro, those both have the facility within them of recognizing ownership of the land. And if you own it, then you must have an address, and if you have an address, you can be taxed. And if you are a taxed resident living in something that you can call as your own, then the government cannot come along and just destroy it when they want to. That's why recognizing ownership and recognizing neighborhood status is so important. Some more images here, really terrible. I mean, if you think about what they're doing, these people have built their homes with their own bare hands out of scrap material, and just because the Brazilian government wants to put a nice clean face on their city for foreigners visiting for the Olympics, they committed basically, I think, what is reasonably arguably a pretty appalling human rights abuse. Which was to destroy huge areas of people's housing. There was no suggestion that people living in these houses were criminal or drug gangs or anything like that. They were just in the wrong place at the wrong time. Self-help schemes. Self-help schemes are a positive story. This is where gentlemen like this are given the materials, basically for free, and they rely on sweat economics. That is where this guy provides the labour and the energy for improving his own house. And because a good question that pupils often ask is like, because pupils are often taught that people build the favelas out of scrap material they find lying around. But if you look closely, these buildings are often built from brick, and there's loads of concrete and corrugated iron. And a good question would be, where are they getting all of this stuff? There's not huge piles of brick and corrugated iron lying around. Well, the answer to that is self-help schemes. The government provides basic resources, and that means that when people do build their own homes, they build them more safely and more robustly, and that can only be a good thing. This is a really niche little detailed case study, but I do like this case study, so I tend to kind of go into the detail on it. Whatever picture you ever look at of a South American favela, in Brazil, that is, just in Brazil, you will see Fort Lev. A great example of a private enterprise company. They're a private company, a profit-making company, who basically specialise in making one thing, and that's these plastic buckets you see on top of the favelas. Now, these are designed to capture rainwater, and it's that rainwater people use to drink and to wash in and everything. A point worth noting here, if you're into construction and engineering and stuff, is that the people who build these favela houses have got some serious skills about them, by the way, because you think how much one of these tanks weighs. Just think how many hundreds and hundreds of kilos of water fits inside one of those tanks, and look how many of the tanks are on top of this building. And these local, uneducated people have been able to construct houses of their own that can support all of that weight. Really quite remarkable. So companies like Fort Lev specialise in making water butts to make storage of safe drinking water possible. Now that is a very niche little case study. You can chuck it in if you want to, but I think it's a nice one to kind of sum things up on. Getting back to the nasty side of things, pacification. I'm not going to dwell on this. It tends to be that it seems teachers can spend hours talking about pacification squads because the photos look cool, but the reality is you're only going to score 1 mark out of it. It's seen as overly aggressive, and it has, however, it has reduced crime. You can see, I'll let you interpret what's going on in the back of this truck for yourself. They've not just been to the butchers, you know. These are, we hope, guilty criminals who have been captured. Unfortunately, the gangs they don't disappear. They just move to another area. And the favelas, remember, there's not like a street map of the favelas. You can easily disappear and relocate to another area, or they just lie low for a while and then come back. So it's not really been very successful. Okay, if you've seen any of my previous lessons, you'll know that this is quite a common technique that I use. You have 3 exam questions to answer. You have, why does the favela need to change? You have, what are the solutions that we're going to put in place to make those changes happen? And how effective have those solutions been? Each row of the table basically makes a model answer. The need for change section, obviously, you're going to need to expand that into full sentences. The solutions section, you would need to refer to my previous notes and comments. And the effectiveness bit is going to need you to talk through a little bit about what the problem is, what the solution is, in order for you to be able to talk about what the effectiveness is, otherwise it won't make sense. So by stitching these 3 columns together, you can form model answers very quickly. It's a good way of revising. You should make tables like this, and you can either copy these ones directly. I wouldn't recommend that. I would make your own versions which include the details that you've heard me talk about and that you've seen in the pictures. So the first need for change is basically that we have too many people and not enough space. This goes on to create a whole host of problems, like sanitation problems, like fire spreading quickly and easily. The solutions I've decided to mention here are clearance and forced eviction. That's the oldest, most historical solution, and therefore is the first one that I'll talk about. It can cause civil disobedience, it only makes way for wealthier parts of the city to expand, and as I covered earlier, if you improve an area of the city in some way, you can often increase the rents, and that makes it impossible for old residents to return. Okay, another big problem, and this is really getting to the root of the problem, is that the favela communities don't have proper citizen status. Nobody recognises their neighbourhoods as part of a city. Nobody recognises them with a postcode or a sense of identity or a sense of neighbourhood address. This is when you can mention the plano diretor, it assigned neighbourhood addresses. It gave the ability to tax locals. It also created a property market. Because people had an address, that meant they could then sell their house, and that lent to that a sense of community growth and people being upwardly mobile in society. This is a really important row in the table. You're going to score very good marks with a full understanding of how column 1 relates to column 2 to column 3. Next, built on steep land or limited space. This is talking about the physical geography of the favelas. We know that Rio de Janeiro doesn't have that much land. It's surrounded by mountains and the sea. And the favelas are often built on very, very steep areas because of that. Fences are erected to stop apparently, so the government say, to stop rainforest areas being destroyed to make way for the favela. But local people say those concrete walls are erected to stop the favela spreading any further and to contain the problem. So it's kind of, in effectiveness, it's often seen as ghettoizing the favela behind a wall. And it's seen as a way of keeping the favela contained, not as a way of saving the rainforest being destroyed. I like this point. I think it summarises a lot of the problems that the favela people face, you know. Okay, moving on. Basic infrastructure. There are clearly massive problems with lights, drains, pavements, and nuts. there's clearly massive problems with lights, drains, pavements, etc., etc. And you can talk about those at length, that the lack of lighting can cause crime, drains can cause disease, lack of pavements means it's crowded and difficult to move around. When you talk about the solutions, though, you need to tie them to something real. So you should talk about the Favela Bairro, and this is when public funding allocated to these improvements was made available. However, remember, a lot of that money was spent in the wrong areas, or it was basically siphoned off by corrupt officials. This will also allow you to talk about site and service schemes, and it will also allow you to talk about self-help schemes. So the Favela Bairro is very useful for that. Then finally you should talk about how the favelas are very unsafe, crime-ridden and with drugs and gangs and so on. I like to put this one last because I think it's really unfair to the people living in the favelas that everybody, the first thing they think about is drugs and crime. Actually, the favelas are an amazing feat of human ingenuity and a testament to the skill and the will of the people that live in them. That said, though, there are issues with crime, and this is where you should use the Mercer Carioca case study, where pacification squads were put in place to clear the favelas up before the Olympics and before the World Cup. Effectiveness I've covered in detail already, but one that I'll just hearken to again is that when we clear up an area and reduces crime rate, this can actually mean that the locals who are left behind can no longer afford to live there because the newly safe area has an increased rent. Right, so what would this exam question look like? Well, you can see on the screen here. Evaluate the effectiveness of strategies used to improve housing in Iberia or any other developing world city you've studied. Your case study is Rio de Janeiro, and you really need to produce the detail, the depth and detail of the story. You are not going to get that by just listening to this video once, or scanning your notes 10 minutes before a mini test in class. The only way you're going to get the level of understanding and detail is by spending time with these notes, reading them several times, copying them out, reading those copied notes, making them into tables, not just copying the table I gave you, but making your own table which simplifies the notes for your own understanding. There is a gulf in difference between the pupils in higher classes. There are those who take this advice and produce high quality, very detailed answers that are just rammed to the rafters with case study information. And then there are people who basically just cannot get out of the headspace of being a National 5 pupil. And you need to decide who you're going to be, because the National 5 level of talking about this is just going to get you nowhere. It's not even going to be a pass. You really need to bite the bullet and try and learn the case study information for this, one of the most challenging units of the course.